And so here we were in the studio, and I'm wondering what Roy is going to do. And we're having trouble getting emotional guitar work out of Buckethead. And there's a lot of Buckethead stories for other episodes, but what I wanted to point out, because this is a tribute to Roy Thomas Baker and his genius, was, Bucket told a story to Roy and I one afternoon before we were getting ready to record him about how he was born into a family of chickens, and he had this whole thing, and I'm thinking that he actually believed it all. But, obviously he's a human. He wasn't born into a family of chickens. And Roy just casually asked him, he said, Bucket, he goes, what could we do that you think would bring out some more emotion in your playing? And he goes, it's kind of sterile being in a recording studio. I grew up in a chicken coop with a mom and dad chicken. He goes, can you just build me a chicken coop and let me record inside there, and then I'll remember my childhood and I'll be able to record. Well, guess what? Roy, the master of creating that ambience to get the best work out of someone in the recording studio, he created a chicken coop for Buckethead. It had like a sofa in it. It had like the chair he wanted to sit and play guitar on. It had a monitor where he could watch videos of whatever inspired him to record. And we got a lot of great work out of him. So it's pretty amazing, we finally got emotion out of Buckethead, and it was Roy that figured it out to build him a chicken coop. And what I also learned is that, nothing had changed from 1984's Tooth and Nail working with Roy to the last time I worked with him in 2001 on Chinese Democracy, RTB finding a way to get the best creative spark for artists. And now I want to go back to the Motley Crue days, because, I was having this struggle with Motley Crue over the name of the next record. So we, obviously the first record came out and we got that one done. And now we're working on the next one. And the band want to call it Shout with the Devil, and I was opposed to that. I wanted to call it Shout at the Devil, not Shout with the Devil. So Roy was always having these amazing parties, and let me tell you, no one could throw a better party than Roy Thomas Baker at his Sunset Plaza house right above the Strip. And he had like the greatest swimming pool and hot tub known to mankind. In fact, it was kind of like Vegas. Some of the things that happened there stayed there and have stayed there. Although maybe one day someone will coax me into pushing some of them out of my mouth. But we had this amazing party up there, and everybody's having a great old time. And Roy had locked all the gates because most people, I was completely sober, but everybody else was pretty out of it, and Roy didn't want anybody getting in their car and getting into trouble. Well, Nicky Sixx somehow managed to get out. He got in his car and drove it down the side of Laurel Canyon and rolled a few times, and he ended up in the hospital. And whatever happened with that experience, it was shortly thereafter that Nicky agreed that, maybe shouting with the devil and supporting the devil wasn't such a great idea. So there was Roy with his party, changing the course of history with his ambiance. And I'll talk about, there was another party that Roy had, and his parties were epic. And it was Thanksgiving, and he had a big Thanksgiving party. And I took my dad to the party, and this was really funny. We walked in, and Rick Nielsen was kind of standing at the door, and Rick Nielsen, and again, Roy also produced Cheap Trick. I forgot to mention that earlier. He did some Cheap Trick records. In fact, my brothers and some of my friends, we drove Roy's limo from Rick Nielsen's house in Rockford, Illinois, all the way back to Hollywood. So anyway, Rick Nielsen looks at my dad and he goes, "What are you doing here, old man?" And my dad said, "Well, I don't know who you are, but you're no spring chicken yourself." And I just busted out laughing because it was really true, because, kind of like some other bands were, like McMars was older than everyone else in Motley Crue. Rick Nielsen had a band before Cheap Trick called Fuse. I mean, so it was a bit like the pot calling the kettle black with him and my dad. But to see the look on Rick Nielsen's face when my dad said, well, you're no spring chicken either. And Roy had a traditional turkey, and then he had a curry turkey, because he loved Indian food. And, I mean, it was a feast fit for a king. And Roy shouts out, are you ready for dessert? And these two girls pop out of a gigantic cake. We think we're going to eat the cake, but no, there were girls in it. And they came out and did a dance. And the rest of the stuff, like I said, what happened at Roy's party stays at Roy's party in that backyard. But they were epic, and I'm sure other people are telling stories. But Roy was a genius. He knew how to have a party. He knew how to find the right way to get someone in a studio to perform the way that they needed to perform. Just another technical side to Roy, I learned from him a lot about making records. Like, there's no way when I was working with Tesla that I would have been able to tell Thompson and Barbiero that, in spite of telling me they'd taken a certain effect off Jeff's voice that I think watered it down, and I wanted it to have the edge that it has. Without Roy's training, I would have been never able to figure that out and even point to the device they were using to do it. And it's just small things like that at the time, you assimilate all this knowledge, kind of like the Borg in Star Trek. One of the other things that I learned with Roy was never cut a record with anyone but George Marino. George Marino, who's passed on, was the greatest cutting engineer that I ever worked with. His records sounded way better than anybody's. And if it's an RTB record, you want to look on the run-out groove for RTB's initials, and you want to look for the Sterling symbol and the GM initial for George Marino, because those are going to be the best cut records that you've ever heard in your life. And Roy would always tell me, we have to go to George, and if George wasn't available, then the record would get put on hold for the 3 weeks it took to get. Now, Roy recorded a bunch of Queen records, A Night at the Opera, Sheer Heart Attack. They were at Rockfield Studios. And, Roy was happy to share. He was generous. He was happy to share his spirit, his soul, his food, his cooking, his secrets, his engineering, his production. And Roy was always very generous. He always credited Freddie Mercury with coming up with the idea to turn Bohemian Rhapsody into an opera. And when I watched the movie, I was pretty disappointed that Queen elected to not give Roy any credit for the technical genius and greatness that he gave to the Queen records, because he was always generous towards them. And it was disappointing that they were not generous back to him. Another funny thing, and these are some anecdotes. So when I was in high school, a guy it was called Western Stereo back in the time, but it was kind of like what Best Buy is today. And so, I went to this Western Stereo, and then it became Pacific Stereo. And the guy there told me the best speakers he'd ever heard in his life were these little Braun output Cs. And I looked at them, and they were tiny. And of course, when you're a teenager, you always think bigger is better. And so I bought a pair of those speakers, and ultimately I loved them so much, I put them in the back deck of my car, my Ford Maverick. It had a shark in it, a horseshoe crab, and these Braun output C speakers. And so after I passed the test, and this was one of the other things with Roy, he asked me what my favorite speakers were, and I said Braun output C, and he goes, it stopped him in his tracks. He didn't say a word for about a minute, and he goes, you read that somewhere? You read that in a magazine or something? I go, no, right? And I said, I'll prove it to you, because I've got a box at home where there's a picture of my Maverick with these Braun output Cs. And he goes, I want to see the picture. So it took me a couple of days, but I dug through the box of pictures that I had brought with me to California from Chicago, and I showed him the picture, and like that was the last, like there were no more tests after that. You know, we were inseparable for such a long time. And, you know, one of my other favorite Roy quotes is, and I'm going to read it to you, he goes, "I need to be involved in every aspect. Producing isn't just about getting a pretty drum sound. It has to do with whether the songs are excellent and acceptable." And Roy would never acknowledge to anyone he had a sound, but people would always say to him, and I observed this traveling around with him, he goes, "Roy, this record, it sounds like a Roy Thomas Baker record." And I would be like, it's nice, it's big, and it's loud. And yeah, George Marino cut it loud, so Roy's records were louder than anybody else's. And I want to say, like, one of the greatest moments that I had with Roy was that trip, that very first trip that he made me figure out how to fly with a bedroom upstairs on a 747 from LA all the way to Sydney. So we stayed in Sydney for 6 weeks. It was an A&R exploration trip. We were looking for bands, right? And I mean, he rented like a mansion in Sydney by the cricket grounds there. Those of you who are Australian will know where I'm talking about. The house came, it was kind of like an Airbnb, but it was like a mansion with 3 servants, a maid, and a butler. And we lived in this thing, and, you know, it was clean. They cooked for us, and we spent the afternoons going around meeting with managers and record label people and our distributor, Warner Music, down in Australia. And then at night, we looked at probably 100 bands. And we only found one that we thought was great. And it was In Excess and Michael Hutchence. We believed that Michael Hutchence would be a big star. The band blew us away, and guess what their encore was? One of my favorite songs of all time, Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple. And I swear that In Excess version of Smoke on the Water was spine tingling. It was incredible. And after the show, they invited us to a speakeasy in, you know, in Sydney. And this was like, you know, you had to know how to knock on the door in order for it to open. And we went in there and we hung out with the band, and it was a great night. And Roy was at his finest. He was laughing, he was giggling, he was telling stories, and, you know, the whole place, the eyes were riveted to him. Michael Hutchence, the other members of the band, they were all riveted to Roy's storytelling. And I was thinking, man, here we are in Sydney, Australia. We've been looking for almost a month for a great band, and we found it. We got it. You know, all the money we spent to fly on those 747s with beds upstairs, all the money for that house, all the money for traveling around, and it's going to deliver because this band will be big. Well, and the last funny moment was these 2 women came up to Roy and literally asked him if he wanted to come into the restroom and watch them pee. And I thought they were joking, right? I just started laughing. I thought it was a joke. Well, no, they dragged him and he went. And I guess he watched him pee. I didn't go, so I don't know if they actually did that or not. But I just thought, this is the craziness of the world I'm entering into, this whole rock and roll world. I'm learning from a guy whose impact to music is not measurable. It's immeasurable. Like, all these great records that he made, all these great records that were part of his foundation, all these great engineers, even George Martin from the Beatles and Jeff Emmerich themselves, Tony Visconti, I mean, I've already been through it. You could start from the top and hear all their names again, but it was phenomenal. The greatest disappointment, we get back from that trip, and we do everything to sign in excess, and they end up signing with our in-house competitor, Atlantic Records. But I want to say to you, Roy, I know you're up there. Your impact on my life and your musical genius changed the world. And you truly captured the capturing lightning in a bottle that I strive to and worked hard to capture for my entire career. And I hope you're looking down on us and making music up there. So please like, follow, and subscribe. If you have any questions, just go to Tom Zutaut at Can You Get Me In? TikTok, Facebook Reels, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you go find it, ask any questions that you have. And this is the Roy Thomas episode. I'll talk to you soon.